I'm ready.
Welcome to Meeting of the Minds. We're glad to have you here for tonight's lecture. Thank you for being patient with us as we figure out the logistics for our very first presentation in the new conference room. The title of tonight's lecture is Where Good Ideas Come From. It will be presented by Stephen Zutfly. Before we begin, I'd like to explain our format at Meeting of the Minds for those of you that are new. If you look up at the presentation area, you'll see what we call a cue board. We use the cue board so we don't encounter confusion or disrupt the lecture. It puts everyone in line to talk, as the name implies. As the presenter is lecturing, if you have a question, please click on the cue button. This will put you in line to speak when the presenter is ready to stop.
There's a note card I'm trying to send out to everybody from the lecture material, starting with a lot of analogies to biology. And again, by trade, I'm a biologist, and so I really appreciate and really can understand in, I think, a pretty nicely deep fashion some of the analogy he uses from biology. And of course, some of the great examples he uses, including John Snow with cholera and Charles Darwin, are examples he uses in his book, and those are, of course, great minds in the area of medicine or biology. So Steven Johnson has given a pretty nice TED Talk summarizing his book, and that's going to be in the note card. And you can watch that at a later time. There is a video I'm going to pop into local chats, and will pop up on the Meeting of the Minds board. And this takes about 4 minutes to play. So I'll throw that in, and then we'll continue the discussion after you've had a chance to see that. So this is a nicely condensed version of the ideas in his book. Something has happened. Oh, there we go. Okay, so my voice is working. All right, so no, I think my voice disconnected for just a second there with my headphones. So let me talk, and let me just summarize a couple key points from what he was talking. And again, this is just going to be hopefully a quick summary of some thoughts I've had about it, and they'll move into more of a discussion. That what has been one of these nice traditional narratives about how technological innovations occur is that you have some brilliant person working and toiling alone, and then with some sort of flash of insight is able to come up with a new idea. And then, again, in some cases even they have to work really hard to convince the money backers at B to get them to actually turn their work into something that goes out there. And again, Steven Johnson is talking about this idea that a lot of course important innovations are not one person's idea. And even if one person has a flash of insight, one is probably related to other ideas or topics that other people also brought to him, and that also you want to set up, and what may be an important design consideration in modern times is to set up spaces that allow people to have real good interactions that facilitate this happening more often. The book itself talks about several important conceptual ideas. The adjacent possible, again, this is the idea that very few innovations occur in an advanced technological form way before the regular community can support it. So a lot of inventions are actually designed for the adjacent possible, something that is feasible by current technological standards, and then by bringing pieces together or a new thought that iterates it a little bit forward, you have a new invention. So for example, it would be very hard to have the modern day computer if silicon dioxide processing wasn't working. Or for example, anybody here who ever owned the Apple Newton, the Apple Newton was a great idea and conceptually a precursor to the iPhone, but without wireless Wi-Fi networks highly available, the connectivity made it not as useful an invention. The other idea he mentions is the slow hunch, and that is as people learn and generate and become thinkers in some sort of space, they don't have all the pieces putting it together. But what they have to do is retain the nugget of the idea of something being important. So the example he gives is Charles Darwin, who was reading about geology. He went on the voyage of the Beagle and had lots of observations, but he actually still was essentially a creationist until several years after he took the voyage and started collecting and analyzing his specimens. The other example that also deals with Darwin is the fact that one of the conceptual influences on evolutionary theory was Thomas Malthus, and that Darwin read Malthus a long time ago, and that it wasn't until many years later that he had a flash of insight that allowed him to connect that to evolutionary theory. Now you'll notice that my presentations template, I actually used the water and bubbles form, and the important idea here is that if you have too rigid a structure, if you have something more like a solid as compared to a liquid, then ideas can't flow and connect. By the same token, if you think about air and gases, those are places where some chemical reactions can take place, but they're too transient, they're not stable, and when reactions do take place, how do you get a bunch of them to congregate together? And so the idea, again, is that networks need to be liquid, which is they're malleable enough to move and collide and connect, but they're in a form that's stable enough that if a new idea comes together, it can stick together for a little while. Serendipity, I think, is relatively self-explanatory, but what's important to recognize in this idea of collisions is that one thing you can do to enhance innovation is to promote things that promote more collisions, and thus serendipity can play a greater role in bringing innovations together. the last example, or the last kind of structure, and this is, I think, a very important idea in biology and evolution as well, is this idea of platforms. Is that platforms are a broad base of enabling technologies, and then you build the adjacent possible innovations on top of that. And what's important is that people have access or the ability to manipulate or use and repurpose platforms. One great example in biology that Steven Johnson did not use in the book is flowers. And that flowering plants are actually a relatively recent group on the evolutionary scene. They're really only about 130, 150 million years old on the planet. And yet, everywhere you look, things are flowering plants. And that's because the blossom is a platform for innovative structures. So the Venus flytrap is an example of an innovative structure of that petal. And by the same token, the most diverse species on the planet are the animals are insects, which co-evolve with plants and specialize and become co-evolving organisms that specialize together with specializing flowers. And so that diversity, that becomes a platform where diversity and innovation can then take place. And I think this is a quote that comes from Steven Johnson's TED Talk. He says, we should connect ideas, not protect them. So if any of you are familiar with the intellectual property space when it comes to technology, or you've read about Apple suing Samsung and Samsung countersuing Apple, then that's an example where as the more often people try and protect an idea, then the opportunities for collisions, or people fearing that if they try and use someone else's innovation that they'll get sued, is something that is a great barrier to innovation. So one example he gives in the book is Twitter. Twitter is a platform, and people have access to the advanced programming interfaces. So a lot of what we think of as Twitter, which let me just say I'm not a user of Twitter, so I can't say much about it firsthand, but what I've read from his book is that a lot of the functionality that people are familiar with Twitter is actually not Twitter. It's something that people built on as modules on top of that because they had access to how the platform worked. This is one example that Steven Johnson talks about in the book, and this is actually based on some academic research from Jeffrey West, and he published this in 2009 in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And in the bottom graph here is showing on the y-axis, this is essentially innovationists, and measured largely by, say, the amounts of patents, the amounts of inventions that are occurring, and the x-axis is the increasing population density for a variety of surveyed cities. And so what is remarkable here, and that you'd have to zoom in to look at this, these are both natural log scale axes. And so this is a more than exponential relationship, that the more people you put together in high density, so the more people you put together in a small space, like New York City or Chicago or Silicon Valley, then you get a dramatic increase in the amount of creativity, inventiveness that then takes place. So this is one of these ideas where cities can become cities by congregating people together physically allows for more collisions, and thus more innovation and more serendipity. These are examples that Stephen Berlin didn't, but these are ones that I thought of immediately after I was reading the book and thinking about it. That who's familiar with Pixar? You might have heard of them. They were a dramatically independent studio that were incredibly creative, taking advantage of new technologies, and really leveraging very strong creative talent to become, again, one of the most successful animation companies in a short amount of time. And one of the examples, this comes from a webpage called 10 Things You Didn't Know About Pixar, although it's been written about in other places, is that some of their greatest early successful movies, A Bug's Life, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, and WALL-E, all were the result of an hour-long lunch among several of the top executives and creative people in the company. And so, again, 4 people coming together to have lunch, and then having this free flow of ideas and creativity, and again, also one where they were not trying to say, oh, well, I want to have my own movie produced. They were very open about their information, that's a part of the dramatic success. And so, again, collisions, bringing people together. And one of the, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this story, so I'll ask, does anybody recognize this picture? Anybody, if anybody's been there, I'd be impressed. I've never been there. No. So again, it's related to the story I was just mentioning, that when Steve Jobs was saying, how should we design a Pixar headquarters? What are some important features of this? And so this is actually Pixar headquarters. That was built in about 2000. And it's considered a model of design. It's one of the early companies trying to think about how you use your space in terms of the internal structures, the locations of various important services to maximize your employees' productivity. And so again, this gives an excerpt from a web page, the web page previously mentioned, that what they did with this big central atrium is that's where they had the gift shop and that's where they had the cafeteria, but it's also, and this is unique apparently to Steve Jobs, said, this is the only place we're going to have bathrooms in the entire building. So again, what he was forcing his own employees to do was to actually congregate in certain parts of the place. And in fact, I think there have been several movies, or definitely several shorts from Pixar that were the result of different creative individuals coming together and meeting in that space, and then they developed new projects. There are other aspects of the corporate structure of Pixar that I'm not going to go into, but again, they put an important emphasis on the idea of openness to ideas, and that's okay for managers to be, say, surprised that there's not always a top-heavy organizational structure. So, again, in terms of a modern-day thinking, that if you want innovation, if you want new ideas, then you need to make things happen in the fourth quadrant. And this is a term that comes from Steven Johnson, talking about, again, you can categorize innovations as being whether they're from a market-based solution or a non-market, and whether they were developed out of networks or non-networked. Non-network maybe being like a lone wolf inventor. And so this fourth quadrant is the non-market networked area. And in terms of design, what's important then is to build spaces that foster collisions, making sure that people have knowledge and retain hunches, and then having those hunches coming together. And what's important to recognize is that, again, whatever sort of creative space you have, that you're not censoring people from working together or sharing their ideas. Now, I think this is something that applies both to education and also to our personal lives. And one area of innovation that many cities have, so if you think about Boston, it's considered an area of high creativity. And how many four-year universities does it have? Quite a number. California is the same way. Again, California Institute of Technology, Berkeley, Stanford, and of course in Boston you have MIT, Boston College. That, you know, universities are also places that bring people together and foster this exchange of ideas and the ability to provide collisions. And so the standard way of thinking about how universities work is that in brick and mortar university, that's a very liquid network. And so let me open this up here, so if you want to answer in local chat, what experience from your college or university experience did you retain and had the most impact on your life? I mean, I'll start out by saying that, you know, my wife is someone that I met in college. And so I say in terms of that's a pretty important one. Yeah, so that's the thing that's interesting about a lot of university experiences, like Martin says, the creativity you had with friends late night in the dorms, meeting with professors. Again, this opportunity to interact with the expertise directly. And again, it may not necessarily be university, even high schools. Again, depending on what sort of high school you went to, there would probably be certain interactions. It wasn't just a matter of going to a class, reading books, and then having that be the most relevant things that you carried with you through the rest of your life. Exactly. Long talks with professors. And so these are liquid networks. And again, if you think about some of the opportunities, Facebook is a good example where the creative individuals behind that and the funding actually occurred at a university campus. Yeah, and then again, also universities provide opportunities for people to meet together that then also maybe at adjacent university college villages and local Starbucks. Again, if you look at the building and the local communities, universities tend to be these centralized areas where then people will build around because they know they have young people who are buying and doing stuff and sometimes have more free time than they should. Exactly. So, and I just want to impress or make the strong point with your help that universities as brick and mortar places, which most of us have experienced, those are the places that are these nice liquid networks, and they foster innovation, they foster ideas, they foster opportunities for serendipity. And of course, one of the major innovations, quote-unquote innovations, I would say, in universities these days is the idea of moving stuff to the cloud. So you can have online classes, online delivery. You can have these things called massive online open courses in which 150,000 people take a class at the same time. And again, if we want to extend the analogy of solids, liquids, and gases, this whole idea that we think of networking spaces in the cloud, I think also represents this idea that while those spaces are maybe a little more, allow a little more collisions than just plain gas and air, they're not nearly as able to form stable connections as a fully liquid. So I think this analogy, extending the analogy of clouds to online distance learning still makes a lot of sense. And yeah, so we can cover that question at the end. I just have a couple more slides, and then we'll get the Q-board up and running. And so again, both in terms of those like social media, which are platforms which are used for classroom instruction, but also just in your personal life, what kinds of networks are LinkedIn and Facebook? Again, how many people have had professionally productive interactions in Facebook or LinkedIn? Yeah, I would say it's not that you can't. I mean, I find one of the great ironies of LinkedIn, of course, is that if you're someone who's looking for a job, that, of course, almost everybody else in your network already has a job. And so it's not it doesn't necessarily mean that they will connect you to the job that you want. I mean, I do agree with the idea that LinkedIn and Facebook has these opportunities for creating connections, but really how solid are those connections always going to be? How much does an email exchange really lead to new jobs? How much does it really lead to new innovations and new collaborative spaces that are lasting within those areas? And I think when universities are trying to move their space into these types of social media platforms where you have instructional delivery, maybe some project-based stuff, you're still not creating a really truly liquid network. Now, I do want to pose the question, especially given where we are. Yeah, Hunter, so let me come back to that one in a little bit too, because I think that's an important point. Is that, again, what sort of network is Second Life compared to places like LinkedIn or Facebook? And I think everyone who's here, you've had several persistent and consistent interactions with people. Again, this is a place where I feel like I've formed a more liquid network with Star and Ray by actually having a place to come to and interact. Because that's the thing about LinkedIn and Facebook, is that what you have is you have almost all the experience you have with those networks is, even in your own mind, with a computer screen. Whereas I would make the argument that with persistent spaces like you have in Second Life or other virtual worlds, is that you have something more akin to a place, a sense of place that allows for more persistent interactions. Again, maybe it's not the fully liquid network like a brick and mortar university, but maybe it's a little bit more like condensation, where, well, sometimes on a dry day the condensation goes away, but in most cases you can have this opportunity for real, true, persistent interactions. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the popular things that you have in Second Life is, basically recreations of restaurants and coffee houses, or even bathhouses. I agree. I mean, I think you get a better sense of a person by having those interactions with them in a virtual world. So the case I want to make, and this is really just my last slide, I'm going to open up to the Q-board and answer some local chat questions, is that when we think about the value to universities, to companies, to even your professional life, what are the types of areas in which you can have not just having an interaction, but having those interactions that have the ability to stick and to lead to really bringing two creative slow hunches or two creative ideas together. And I mean, I think in addition, of course, Second Life has this opportunity for much greater artistic expression than you would find that you can share with other people as well. And so I think that's a little bit different than the innovation idea, but the idea that's also a social space, then those are areas that help maintain that cohesion between individuals. All right, so I will actually just end what I wanted to say there. I'm going to move this over a little bit, so it's no longer blocking the keyboard. And I'm going to address one thing that I saw from Huntress, which is the idea of websites are great for generating traffic. And I do not in any way disagree that these types of networks where you have the opportunity, it's much easier for someone to check out your storefront by clicking a computer, being on a network. That all works really well, but those aren't necessarily the types of collisions where then you're collaborating with one of your customers to then create something new. At least depending on what sort of business you have. But again, it could lead to leads, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that, but just in terms of collaborative opportunities, I feel like web pages are still a little too gaseous, too much in the cloud. So that's pretty much all I wanted to kind of say and present and put out there. So, for the Q-board, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer that. But then also, if people would be interested in sharing their experiences of how, either at the university or company setting, what sort of interactions and what sort of spaces have been very fruitful for things that have affected your professional life or personal life.
Stephen, with the avatars all over the grid all the time, what would you suggest might be a good way to build a community like that where you encourage people to come together so that they can bounce these ideas off of each other? Because in a university, they have classes that they have to go to at certain times of the day, and that's how they come together. What happens after that? At any rate, do you have any ideas about that?
So you're talking about a more networked university specifically?
How would you suggest that we do that here in Second Life, because you've been doing educational things here in Second Life? So how do you get the people to come together in one place in order to bounce those ideas off of each other?
Well, I guess I don't specifically have any specific suggestions or ideas that I would say I've successfully implemented and used. I've had a lot of students where they've come into Second Life, they've come to the classes, but then they do not persist in Second Life. And a part of the idea I would like to have going forward is that, you have to have investment in going to a place. Again, any place you go is because you feel some sort of either value to going there or you have an investment to going there. And I think that that's true in the social spaces one can create online as well. Again, some people love discussion boards, and it's because they feel like they get an opportunity to say what they want to have, that other people respond to what they have to say. So, I was just saying in general, you'd want to find these ways of creating investments in those spaces. Thanks for coming, Huntress. That, in Second Life, in addition to having educational opportunities, again, opportunities for students to come to class, is that you want to do two things. One, create social opportunities. and that is either dances or guest speakers or lecture circuits or stuff that brings people in with an investment that this is a good idea and that they'll have a fun time. And then the other thing that's really important about virtual worlds is that it's a place where anybody can build. I mean, the activation energy to become a creative individual who's contributing stuff to the physical environment or the quasi-physical environments is so much lower in virtual worlds than in the real world. And so if you have people investing as students or faculty creating things, like either developing plays, developing artistic galleries, maybe in developing demonstrations, then that's bringing them in. And then, of course, if they're here building stuff, then that also creates more traffic and opportunity for collisions and more opportunities for people to feel invested. So that's where I see things going forward. In terms of moms doing that, I think the service that Mom has right now. Oh, so peanut butter jelly. Yeah, University of Western Australia, the main guy there talked at the VWBPE keynote, and I can actually pull that one up on my history pretty quickly. That, yeah, they do an amazing job of doing this. So one thing that they had was students doing artistic and machinima competitions. And it's a real environment for students to interact in a real scholarly way, in creative way. Yeah, they really are a leader and an innovator in this space. I mean, in terms of moms, I mean, I think you have to create investments, ideas of investments and value for whether people are going to go and participate in anything.
We're kind of all over the place. I think networking is going to be the answer.
Well, I find it very valuable, in terms of my professional experience in that, I had my student give that talk a few weeks ago. And so for me, this was an opportunity for them to demonstrate and to present and interact with people. And they learned some valuable skills from giving presentations, especially to an outside audience compared to just their fellow students all the time in the classroom. And there are others who are interested, but I think they...
from a different eye,
Yeah.
Because the student is going to forgive them because they're going to be up next. A teacher is going to criticize them because that's what they're paid to do. The kid who's presenting is going to be trying to please the teacher. That kind of dynamic doesn't happen here. It's a different dynamic.
Yeah, and I think that was...
when your student was lecturing that day, I did feel a little bit trying to impress the teacher, kind of.
Well, he was still getting graded for that. Yeah, he was still getting graded.
Of course.
So, yeah.
And he's learning, too. That's what that's all about. So, yeah, get some more of them to come in so that even if they have those other public speaking classes that they're doing at school, they can practice them here and see what they might get better at before they present at school.
I agree. Well, and I actually had an opportunity in a group discussion to talk with Ebby Altberg about universities and education in Second Life. And the question I had posed was, or the suggestion I made was, why not cluster the university sims together? Why not? I mean, Second Life, you have opportunities to meet. But I think that was one of the really neat things about the old days of Second Life, which again was before my time, is that they had this mainland and people were kind of clustered on the mainland. There weren't as many private sims where people could really not have opportunities for collisions. So I think to some degree Second Life has, appealing to some constituents and people invested.
That's why I said they're all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have the resource center now. We set the resource center up to be kind of like a study hall, so people can go over there and sit in a quiet place and do that sprinting stuff that Nat and Blue used to like to do, or use the resources that are there. And right now we're starting to build an avatar library. So we're going to be contacting avatars that have published work to give us to put in the library. So the requirement will be that the work has to be published, and that you have to be an avatar, and then we'll put it in the library.
Oh, that sounds good. And published in what kind of context?
Well, something more than they published themselves on a blog.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say, because if, yeah, I think you want to be elevated above the blogosphere. Yeah, the idea of peer review or that you produce something that sells, that people are willing to pay money for, are good criteria for knowing what's valuable. So, any questions? I mean, anybody see an application of this idea in their own personal lives or companies? I mean, I think one thing that's important that you see a lot of cases is conferences. Conferences are these opportunities for people to network and get together. And they seem like a big expense, $500 to register and $600 to fly there, but that $1,000 could be a huge payoff down the line.
That's true. I've kind of seen this. I have seen this in action, actually, but it was due to a crisis situation at the place that I work at, and I work at Colorado State University Library, and I use some pretty specialized library-specific software that we actually invented at CSU. Now, it came about, we sell the software to different libraries too, so it actually is a moneymaker for my university. But in '97, we had a flood that came through and totally devastated the entire library, flooded. We had a lower level, and a lot of books and journals were down there, and they were completely destroyed. So fall semester was going to be starting up. This happened in the summer, and our students needed to get their books and articles and whatever. But I work in the interlibrary loan department, so this is the department that they came to. And at first we were just, it just started out as actual rides to the University of Wyoming, back and forth, driving, taking handwritten down requests, and we'd have couriers going, dispatching all the time. Well, then we started scanning articles back and forth till finally we developed this software that instead of having to actually scan each book, each article, we could just download it from the internet. You know, copyright restrictions, everything, you know, had to be taken into consideration. But now this software is a beast. We have a 24-hour turnaround time. Less than that sometimes. Sometimes it's only hours. There is no such thing as a rush request in my department because everybody's a rush. I process up to 500 articles a day, and that's not even hard copy books. I don't know. But our developers, it was the interlibrary loan department, along with it was a guy who actually is the director now, but he was actually a student at that time who developed this software. I don't know. It to me, to see something like that, to go from, well, we've been to Australia. We sell to Australia. We have the Boston Library Consortium, University of Massachusetts at Amherst, University of Connecticut, Northeastern, New Hampshire, Williams College. There's a lot of places.
Those ain't shabby schools.
No, they're not. They're not. MIT. There's a lot. I'd have to take a count, but Canada's in there. It's not only national, it's international. So, yeah, we're going to Australia next. Wollongong.
Neat. Well, and I think that thinking about things this way also gives us an opportunity to re-examine the cliche, necessity is the mother of invention. Because I think on the one hand, people see a problem, we need a solution to this. But what a lot of times a crisis or necessity really does is it brings people together to brainstorm or to share ideas for a solution. And so the idea that this guy who wrote the program, he probably never would have necessarily done it on his own, but by having this crisis and opportunity and people saying this is something that we need, then suddenly that came together. And so I think the idea of necessity, it's not just a matter of that you need it, it's a matter of what happens in order to make it happen. And that's an important
Steve, the neat thing of it is that he was a computer science major, but his student job was working in interlibrary loan. So when he graduated, he was still working for Interlibrary Loan, but only as a programmer. So it worked out very nicely for him.
That worked out very well for him.
Mm-hmm. For all of us, actually. He's homegrown. Yeah, we're very proud of him.
Yeah, I think there are several interlibrary loan systems. I've been at a couple universities where they did that. And in the old days, if I wanted to go find, I'm old enough that I still would primarily go to the library and with a photocopy card, and I would get journal articles. But that accessibility to information, and again, this is where Steven Johnson makes, in many of his other writings and talks, makes the point that the internet is one of these things that facilitates these interactions. And again, kind of like.
And
the reason I have to do 500 articles each day is that because people do have the internet and they're allowed to make those requests, in the middle of the night when they have their own brainstorms. So, yeah, I have them waiting for me in the morning.
Sorry, you were saying, Star?
I don't even know what a copy card is, so that's how old I am.
Well, there actually is another paper that came out. I think this is something that is still a bit of a cautionary tale when these network services become so useful that there was a paper in Science that came out in about 1999 or maybe 2001 that was surveying what sort of papers scientists read. And this was around the time that search engines became very useful. So what you would do as a scientist is figure out 5 or 6 key terms that were most relevant to your work and then request and download and search those papers and read those. And actually showed that was counterproductive to scientists being more widely read. So one thing I always tried to do when I was a grad student is I would actually read Science, Nature, and Cell cover to cover. Or whenever I went to go find an article or would read something where I had to actually have the magazine, I would look through the table of contents to make sure I wasn't missing anything that could seem like an adjacent possible idea. And so, but a lot of people don't do that. A lot of people let their habits narrow and restrict their focus. So actually, it changes the equation depending on how useful and how targeted a technology service can be. So, I think it's important to keep that in mind, that don't let yourself fall into habits that actually create tunnel vision. You want to still have, again, keep your eyes wide. Go ahead, Star.
I do. Oops.
Yeah, I think that I've seen exactly what you're talking about with the way that the people get their news today, because they're not getting a newspaper with a variety of what's going on all around. So when they get it from the internet, they go look up what they're specifically interested in, and they get it in news bits, kind of a thing. And so everybody doesn't really have a wide idea about what's going on, and the newspapers are dying. An industry now as a result of it. So this is the new way people will get news. Go ahead, Martin. Sorry.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. I just didn't want to interrupt. What you said may have touched on this, but a subject I've listened to, I know that science is your background, so you'd probably have a more qualified opinion. I know in science education, there are basically 2 tiers. There's the magazines and the popular things that people read, like Discover Magazine and National Geographic. Then there's peer-reviewed literature. One of the problems I've heard mentioned by some people in the field is that peer-reviewed literature, it's harder to access. It's not made as accessible. You have to belong to a club, or you have to subscribe to a particular journal or magazine. are there attempts being made to make things like that more accessible to the general public and not just within the scientific communities themselves?
Okay, so yeah, let me answer that in kind of two different ways. Is that in terms of NIH-funded research, people are now obligated to index that and have those papers be in what's called PubMed Central. And so there has been a push that when there's government or publicly funded research, that the openness is there. And that's been true. There's actually a kind of related thread, is there are lots of open access journals now. That PLOS One is one really, really prominent good example. It's actually a very rigorously peer-reviewed, very good articles, but you can go right now to the PLOS One webpage and read as many scientific articles as you want, including reviews. You know, the old style was usually very narrow and very expensive. Yeah, you'd either belong to the American Society of Microbiology, and that's how you would get the journal. Or to buy the journal, you actually had to also get an additional membership in the club. The problem right now is that there's this transition phase. And we're coming out of it now. But there's a period of time where a lot of journals, especially the really big ones and good ones and high-profile ones, wanted to charge libraries both for the print copy and then a pretty large charge for having a digital subscription. And so there was online journals was a disruptive technology to the print journal, and a lot of them were trying to resolve that, and the pricing models were a bit messy and whack. And so even at the university level, like if you're not at a very well-funded university, you're probably only getting a narrow range of digital content journals anymore and not even getting the print ones. So you have these huge stacks of the old versions, but you're not getting the new ones. Just because the pricing and inflation was a bit problematic for a while. But, you know, in terms of the opportunity for normal citizenry, there's what I mentioned about PubMed Central. There are these open access journals, and in fact, a lot of the really prominent journals like Science, and I want to also say Nature, is they self-embargo new articles for about a year, and then after that, I think a lot of them actually are free to access and download and read for anybody. So I think the accessibility of science has become quite different for recently. But it's a little bit here and there, depending on which journal you're talking about. Did I answer your question, Martin?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
At least idea about it, and that's good because things just one way or another are becoming more and more accessible in general. I think it's really only a matter of time. But that's the thing, what you're talking about, the internet and electronic media has exploded this type of connectivity that people have. And things that used to do, you could only have occasionally get a book on or find a video on or view it. It's any subject any time, and people can now interact on it, and so it's getting harder and harder to keep things like that away from you.
So your voice suddenly seems a lot softer to me, so I kind of missed some of that middle part.
It happens. It happens. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, it's short. You did answer the question. At least give me a better idea of what's going on, where that's concerned.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, there's quite a wealth of documentaries out there in terms of video resources, and you know, I think the accessibility of science is becoming very different. The problem is kind of as Stephen Johnson goes back and forth with other people, is while there's more information out there, you know, how much can people really absorb and how much time, and then what do they devote their time to? Because it seems like, you know, Kardashians still pretty much outcompete science as an aggregate even. But then you see something like the rebooted Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson was very popular and got a lot of people talking about it. So I think that's, you know, also good to see. So Elliot, yeah, the idea of science evolving one funeral at a time. God, there's blanking on who said that, but Thomas Kuhn definitely did mention something along those lines in Structural Scientific Revolutions. That, yeah, basically a lot of times the old guard, you have to get them moved out of the way because they hold on to ideas even long past their prime. God, I wonder.
Sorry.
I'm just blanking on where I've heard that phrase from now. That's bothering me. But go ahead.
Especially if they're the ones who came up with that idea and others built off of it, but they don't want to be known as the guy who got built up off of. They just want to be known as the guy who came up with this brilliant idea.
Yeah, and I think there's an even older phrase that Newton. I talked about this in a presentation I gave recently. That Newton, you've heard the phrase "stand on the shoulder." I can see farther because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. Mm-hmm. And I think in the scientific endeavor, even wrong ideas have an important place. I was actually just having this conversation with someone where, actually my cell biology teaching colleague here, that Lamarck was really important for Darwin. That even though we know Lamarckian evolution is wrong, it provided several ideas and a sounding board for Darwin for developing his ideas. And so, even when people have wrong ideas in science, they actually can contribute if it provides some sort of context or something to rail against for someone who's making the correct advances. So Max Planck. So do you have the specific quote? Okay, great. Thank you, Peanut Butter Jelly.
This is actually a big problem in the medical industry, isn't it? Because you have one specialist over here and another specialist over there, and they just treat their specialization, but you don't get a holistic kind of healing.
Yeah, I've heard of that too, and there's a lot that supports that idea and that problem. And what has been actually a horrible economic issue in the medical field is that general practitioners, those people who are family doctors, family medicine, where they ultimately see such a wide variety of symptoms and have to sort through that they're not as competitive in the economic marketplace as people who are specialists, and they don't always coordinate closely with the people of their specialty